Metallica are the largest heavy metal band ever to come out of the United States, having sold over 85 million albums and toured the globe on countless occasions. Starting with the infamous lineup of Lars Ulrich on drums, James Hetfield on guitar, Dave Mustaine on lead guitar and Ron McGovney on bass, Metallica were destined for stardom right from the start. But where did this awesome group come from? This is the story of a drummer, a singer, 2 lead guitarists and 4 bass players who set out to change music forever. Lars Ulrich was born in Denmark. His father was a local tennis pro and encouraged his young son to take up tennis from an early age. His grandmother, however, had other plans. She gave Lars a drum kit on his 13th birthday, a move that would see the young Dane torn between the tennis court and the drum stool for many years to come. In August 1980, the Ulrich family moved from Denmark to Los Angeles, hoping the sporty Californian location would improve his tennis skills. Lars, however, had other ideas.
Lars, of course, came from Copenhagen, from Denmark, brought a lot of the European influences in, like being into Motorhead and Diamond Head and Angel Witch, stuff like that.
I'd say in the early days, Lars's chops were a little rough. You know, he definitely had a very ambitious playing style. He wanted to play really hard and heavy.
Lars is a rock star, and he enjoys being a rock star, and so kudos to him.
You know, I look at him now, and he's a very, he's an awesome, really talented, mature, developed drummer.
Lars, I'd say, is the public spokesman for the band, and more into the business aspect of it.
He can be very professional and very eloquent, and he can be crazy. He can, just mad, just like, ready to go for it, and have fun. I mean, he's just, you know what I mean? He can be a comedian.
Unlike Lars, James Hetfield did not have a happy childhood, relieving the pent-up aggression of his tough upbringing on his battered guitar. James formed a number of bands at both Downey and Bree high schools. When he finally left school, he placed an ad in the Recycler Classifieds looking for other musicians in the area. Lars Ulrich was one of those who responded. Although the pair's initial meeting was not a success, they stayed in contact with each other and eventually, along with Dave Mustaine, formed Metallica.
Early on, I'd say James is more of the stoic member of Metallica.
He would be sitting over in the corner playing the guitar, learning how to play better, learning how to sing and play better.
He's reserved at times and sometimes doesn't talk a lot. Other times he's very humorous, very witty, very down to earth.
Hetfield always does this when he sees somebody, he bites his upper lip and looks at you like that.
James Hetfield is intense, and he always has been intense.
With Lars's Danish background, a number of different musical influences crept into the band. In particular, the heavy metal coming out of Great Britain, which had a huge following throughout Europe during the early 1980s.
What we were very influenced by, which is called the new wave of British heavy metal, was sort of hard rock and metal's direct answer to that movement a few years ago, where metal sort of was brought back down to, from the 70s, you had all the dinosaur bands and everything was sort of very grand and rock stars and all that. And then in 1979-80, the new wave of British metal came about and sort of everything was brought back down to the streets again, and bands were doing their own thing and a little more aggressive and maybe a little faster and just a little more sort of ballsy and gutsy. And I think that's where most of our influences lie.
James and Lars were into a heavier style of rock and found life in the Los Angeles music circles frustrating. The LA music scene of the early 80s seemed more about image than musical ability.
There was a metal scene in LA, and it wasn't quite what they were into at the time. There was Motley Crue's going on and other bands, not quite what they weren't looking for. But up here in San Francisco, there was a more metal type of crowd, more of what they were into.
You know, they were playing the LA scene, and LA was all, glam metal, the whole spandex and, people call it hair bands now. That term didn't exist back then. You just were glam rock, and and they hated that scene. Although they did play with Rat. I heard Rat was one of the few bands that were not afraid to play with Metallica. But and Rat were on the original Metal Massacre.
The band were really struggling to fit into the LA scene. This caused problems with their bass player at the time, Ron McGovney.
Metallica were looking for another bass player. They weren't happy with Ron McGovney, the guy they had before Cliff, and they had seen Cliff play at the Whiskey with his band Trauma, and he stuck out completely from the other band members with his wild headbanging stuff. And they made a point. They said, that's the guy we want to get in our band. And Cliff lived in the Bay Area, which was like a second home for Metallica. They didn't like all the poser scene down in LA anyway. But they tried to get Cliff to come down to LA and join him down there, but Cliff didn't want anything to do with Los Angeles. He was against all the poser scene down there, So they said, if I'm going to join your band, you guys got to move up here, which they did in a second, since they liked the Bay Area.
So they decided to do that. They kicked out Ron McGovney. Well, I think Ron McGovney kind of heard that they were trying to get Cliff, and Ron just wound up quitting, and became a plumber, last I heard, or something.
Chuck Billy is the lead singer of Testament and has fond memories of Cliff Burton and Metallica moving up from LA.
Actually knew Cliff before he got in Metallica. I used to see him in his band Trauma. They actually played at like our high school, back in those days. So we all knew who Cliff was, and when we heard Cliff was going to get the Metallica gig, it was pretty shocking. And then when they were going to relocate up here,
the reason they moved up here is because Lars loved it up here. James seemed to like it up here. They got so much better response in San Francisco, Berkeley, the Bay Area than they ever did in LA. They felt unwanted, I guess, in LA.
Cliff Burton had lived in the San Francisco Bay Area all his life. He had started playing the bass guitar in 1976 and 6 years later joined the band Trauma. The band never achieved great success, except in bass-playing circles, where Burton's talents were legendary.
First time I saw Cliff Burton he was in a band called Culprit from the Northwest, and they were quite good, but they were